So let's start pulling this together. The concept of risk budgeting doesn't mean minimizing risk. It means determining what the risks are, figuring out how to aggregate them, deciding where you're going to take risk, what levels of risk are appropriate in your organization. How do we manage market risk? How are we going to do it? Well, there's different ways we could control it. We could set up position limits. I'm just going to use the examples here. We can put no more than $10 million in any one bond with a market value of A or higher. A limitation, it's creating diversification. It's limiting how much is in any single situation. We could do stop outs. Anything we've got, if it goes down by more than 10%, close the position. Now that's a behavioral finance concept. It's not working for you. Just close it down, walk away, clear your head, come back tomorrow. If you really believe in it, go back into the position. Traditional finance would argue, no, we should just always evaluate theoretically what is the optimal thing to do. Behavioral finance, hey, it's not working. Close it down. Come back and decide tomorrow what you want to do. That could be practical. Risk factors, don't have a beta more than this. Don't take duration of more than Z. You can come up with limitations to control market value risk by doing these things. The basic best position is probably the VAR. It's aggregating all the different positions, what could be lost over a period of time at a specified probability. And we're going to find out a good complement to VAR is what's called scenario analysis or stress testing. You can come up with all kinds of approaches to scenario analysis and stress testing. Let's say you use one called Edward, where you've specified a set of assumptions about what could happen to variables that are important to your organization. Under that scenario, our losses should be, 50 million. Or, said another way, under the scenario, we don't ever want to see worse than that. So now you can run different combinations of strategies and see if you violate that restriction. So VAR is one way to look at things. Stress testing is normally done. Stress testing is a kind of a scenario, an adverse scenario where things are going badly. Generally, we do specify VAR limits. That's considered the more sophisticated way to handle aggregate risks. But we also like to look at various scenarios. What would happen under the following set of conditions? If we're using leverage, we might put limits on how much we can borrow, leverage limits. We might set limits about liquidity so we don't get ourselves into something we can't get out of. We can't have a position that is excessively large in relation to typical trading volume, because the larger our position in relation to the normal trading volume, the harder it's going to be to execute it if we have to get out quickly. Good other ways to think about controlling market risk. When we switch to credit risk, we tend to think of credit risk differently, but again, we could think about, based on credit quality criteria, how much can we have? And of course, we've talked about that. Think back to the institutional portfolio management sessions. We saw things like banks and insurance companies often set credit limits on the kinds of fixed income securities they would own. If we have non-exchange traded derivatives, traditionally there was no cash flow exchange. There was no mark-to-market. But in point of fact, that is changing. You can have an overcount of the derivative and write in a requirement, whoever's winning is going to receive money from the loser. That's called marking to market. That is going to reduce potential credit risk because any change in value is in hand as cash. You could require collateral to be posted to protect in these contracts, even if they're over the counter. You can write in a requirement for collateral. With swaps, we've talked about netting has become the normal standard. You don't wire and wait to receive. Calculate the differential between the outflow and inflow. Only that small differential is exchanged. Credit standards. What's your minimum quality you will go down to? You can also use credit derivatives to adjust credit exposures in a portfolio. But who are you doing your credit derivatives with? Because credit derivatives to date are all over the counter. There are no exchange-traded credit derivatives, at least not yet. So you want to make sure all your counterparties are very high quality. And by the way, that is the general rule, because even if you're doing business with someone who's a low credit quality, they can set up a special purpose entity, an enhanced derivatives product company, where they place a lot of collateral in that unit. It's a standalone legal entity, and any trades in the derivatives markets are done with that enhanced credit quality unit. So there are various ways to protect yourself in relation to credit risk. The purpose of all this is not to just get the risk low. It's to decide where to take acceptable levels of risk in order to make money. Come up with a risk budget. Now, a simple way, as we've suggested, just set an amount you will do in any one position. In position 1, we'll go up to $50 million. You see I put in an example. Position 2, we'll go up to $75 million. Position 3, we will take no more than $25 million. What's my total nominal limits? Oh, that's easy, $150 million. But that's not necessarily very informative. That's the value of a position. Generally, nominal means what is its value? How much would you invest? You can just add them all up. But it fails to consider correlation. It may be that one is winning, the other would be losing. Maybe they have negative correlation. VAR can take into account correlation, and it also doesn't just look at the total value. It says over a period of time, at a probability, what would we lose? And we also start to consider correlation. So let's say the VARs that correspond with each of these nominals are 1 million, 2 million, and 1.5. Notice they're not directly proportional. 50 million with a VAR of 1 million, 75 million, it jumps up to 2 million. Why is that? Maybe the underlying items are more or less volatile. So there's not a linear relationship between a nominal position and the size of its VAR. VAR is more sophisticated. In addition, when I add the VARs of the 3 units, notice it doesn't come up to the simple sum. Because as long as the correlation between those positions is less than 1, the VARs will be less than additive. If the correlations are less than 1, there's a degree of diversification occurring. So that's why VAR has become so important. It can consider these kind of relationships. Of course, the pitfall is that's complexity. You've got to analyze these things, but better to do it and try to have a best guess of what could really happen. But of course, the goal is not just what's the risk, what's the return. So, various ratios, some of these are important. If they are, we'll see them in later areas. Of course, the Sharpe ratio is very important. You know that's used regularly. We've seen it in asset allocation. What's the return over RS? What's the risk premium, the expected return premium, and what is the volatility of the return, the standard deviation of the portfolio, based on normal distribution? And that's its pitfall. Non-normal, not going to work. The Sortino ratio is a similar concept. What is the return? What minimum return are you concerned with? And instead of using standard deviation, let's use downside deviation. Downside deviation is mathematically the same computation as standard deviation. However, the data points used in the computation are only the data points where the return is below the specified minimum acceptable return. You pick the minimum. Let's analyze the deviation of only the data below. If you had a normal distribution, then the downside should actually be the same as the standard deviation. Because in a symmetrical normal distribution, some are better, some are worse. When we do downside, we only are looking at the downside. If it's from a normally distributed pattern, we'd only be looking at half the data, and basically we'd come up with the same number using downside. But if you have skew, it'll be something different than sigma. If you have skew, Sortino would be more appropriate. Maybe even a better way to look at it, what do you think the return will be, and how much can we lose? What capital is at risk? And of course, what does VAR measure? In a for-profit business, when we're looking at the VAR, this is what we can lose. In a for-profit business, where do losses come from? They come out of the equity capital. So this actually is a very sensible thing to do in a business. What is the amount of return for this project? How much could we lose at a given probability over time period? Higher would be better. So good ways to look at things. Return over maximum drawdown. Again, where we've got skewed situations, we could look at downside deviation, or we could look at drawdown. Drawdown is in some ways less sophisticated. We're not trying to project or guess what could happen. Let's say we look at the value of a portfolio over time. We see it go up. We see it come down. We see it go up. We see it come down. We see it go up and exceed the previous, go up, go down. What is the largest consecutive decline as a percentage that has occurred historically? That's what we're going to use. I see a high, I've gone to a low. What is that percentage loss in value? We bounce up, we bounce down, we didn't exceed the high or low, we bounce up again to a high, and then we have another drop. What is that percentage loss? Let's just use history. What's the last worst case been? Notice we don't pay attention to how long it took for the loss to occur. It's a very unsophisticated thing, and that's its benefit. What has happened over a period of time? How much has we lost? And what return are we generating? Higher return to risk is better. So there are various ways to think about risk, and there are various ways to relate that to return. But in all cases, higher return to risk is better. In a profitable business, when you lose money, it's coming out of equity. And that really is what VAR becomes. So VAR can be used to determine the amount of capital we need in our business. You know, over 5 years, as a 5% probability, over 5 years, we could lose $50 million. So 5% of the time, if all we have is $50 million of capital, we've gone bankrupt. If we have less than $50 million of capital, oh boy, it's even worse. Even worse is what can occur. Sometimes the slides jump like that. If we have less than $50 million, we could definitely have gone bankrupt. If that's unacceptable, you've got some choices. Change your business, lower the VAR, make the business less risky, or raise more capital so you would be able to survive that VAR event. Very useful things to do. In addition, stress testing. Why would we also do stress testing? Stress testing is a scenario. By definition, it's a scenario where you're looking at adverse events, things that are bad. We run the test, and we quantify what we think will happen. That's not the end of the analysis. That's the start of the analysis. That was just the mechanical part. Then comes what's interesting. Well, what do we think will happen in this scenario? If we don't like it, then we need to ask some other questions. Are these actually realistic assumptions? Is this something we should actually be thinking about? Are there other scenarios we should look at? Or do we need to change something? So many of these models are not the end of the process, they're the start of investigating further. In the long run, to be successful, you've got to make good decisions. But using the right tools can give you better information in which to make those decisions. That's the point they're making.